All right, good to go.
Perfect. All right, hi everybody. Let me just share my screen here. Oop.
There we
There we go.
Okay.
Oh. No, okay, got it. Great, sorry. I'm doing a little bit of technical stuff today. Okay, yeah, as Nanda said, I'm Zoe Speidel. I am the writing specialist at OHSU. I work with a lot of graduate students and as well as postdocs and some early career faculty on all kinds of writing that they do, whether that is grant writing, manuscript writing, personal statements and job materials, and then all kinds of student stuff, dissertations, qualifying exams, and all of that. I've been teaching writing for about 13 years, all at the college level and graduate level. And I'm really excited to talk about research as storytelling today, because I feel like a lot of students come to me saying, you know, my PI is looking at my manuscript or looking at my grant, and they're telling me, tell the story of your research, tell this more like a narrative. And I think that can feel a little confusing because of sort of our initial associations with story and narrative, and then also just how much different that can feel from academic or professional writing. So hopefully today will give you a different way to think about the intersection between scientific or research-based writing and storytelling, and give you a little bit more like insight maybe into how you can tell more of the story without having to write a story about your research. So, okay. So today we're going to define some key elements of storytelling. We're going to describe the intersection between storytelling and scientific writing. And we're going to discuss a structure called the and, but, therefore structure. And that's going to make a lot more sense when we go along. If you're just tuning in while you eat your lunch and you just want to listen, that's totally fine. If you want to interact a little bit more, please have a document open or a piece of paper or something. We're just going to do a couple of little quick writes, like 1-minute writes, and we'll just share a little bit in the chat. So let's start out with one of those. So just write for 1 minute. What does the word story make you think of? Or how does it feel to think about combining storytelling and scientific writing? You can put your response, you can type straight into the chat if you want, or type in a separate document. All right, that's a minute. So if you just have anything that you've written down, any ideas, just put them in the chat. I see we have a comment from Rosalind for combining storytelling and scientific writing. I think about having a cohesive narrative. Yeah. Katie, the word story makes me think of a message with a beginning, middle, and end. Love that. Sam says, combining storytelling and scientific writing for me means to make it understandable and interesting for a lay audience. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot about structure. We've got narrative, we've got beginning, middle, and end. Understandable structure helps make things understandable. A compelling summary of your research that's impactful and accessible resonates with diverse audiences. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely some allusion here to like the power of story or like how engaging story can be. Yeah, thank you. So we'll start by talking about story. And I really love this definition of story: events that occur in the search for a solution or problem. So almost any story you can think of, whether it's a movie or a book or a scientific article, talk about events that occurred in the search for a solution. I think that should say to a problem. Um, we're not often looking for the problem. So the reason I really like this is because it's so broad, and because it really highlights that the center of every story, the crux of every story is the problem that gets solved, whatever that problem might be: a personal problem, a global problem. Stories also really get our attention, they engage our emotions, and they help us remember. So having a story is not just, or telling your research as a story is not just a tactic to, get people more interested or anything. It also really helps people understand and remember what you're talking about. So it serves a lot of purposes, and really important purposes. But, everything around us, we always want to make sense of things. I had a really weird dream last night, and I was thinking about how funny it is how when you wake up, you're trying to make sense of the dream. And that's like an impulse that our brain has to create a cohesive narrative so that I can make sense of all these random images and people that I ran into in my dream last night. And stories really aren't about twisting science or twisting facts or stating untruths. So I encounter this a lot when I talk about research as storytelling, because sometimes we can feel like we're being encouraged to make up a story about our science, or somehow twist the truth of what really happened as we were going on this journey for, our research project. And it's really not about that. It's really about identifying the different elements of the work that you're already doing and highlighting and putting them together in a way that create a narrative. So we'll talk more about that. So along the same lines of the importance of having a really clear problem that we're solving is this quote from this book called Houston, We Have a Narrative. The tendency of scientists to present endless piles of facts, unable to find the singular narrative on which everyone can focus, has been a reason many important science stories fail to resonate with the public. So you're not always writing for the public. Sometimes you're writing for other experts and peers. But when you are writing for the public, or when you are being asked even to write to people outside of your immediate field, sometimes you're going to need to do a little bit more work to convince them that what you're working on is important. Someone who sits next to you in the lab might know exactly why what you do is important. You know why what you do is important. But being able to communicate that is really, really crucial. So again, just write for a few minutes, for 1 minute. What are some situations where you might need to convince readers that your research is important? And you can put those right in the chat. And these can be situations you've already encountered or situations that you might encounter. Grants, yes. Grant writing, funding, yeah. Presentation, yeah, totally. Right. Even if you're at a conference presentation and the purpose is to share information, you certainly don't want people to walk away wondering, why are they doing this work? What is the sort of purpose of this? Postdoc interviews, yeah. Prove to anti-researchers that our work is important. Yes, these are really, really important. Collaborations, oh, I love that. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, these are all great. Essentially, any situation where like you need something from your audience. So that could be funding, that could be a job, that could be a postdoc opportunity, that could be a collaborator, like if you want somebody to collaborate with you. So there's all kinds of times when we want people to come away from our conversation or reading our work where they feel like our research is important. And I mean, in general, I think all of us want that. Like, and as we become more expert in our areas, it can be really challenging to go into the mind of somebody who isn't an expert and to really articulate to them in a way they'll understand why what you do is important. I was just talking to some students this morning in my class about how they do really like mechanistic research, and they said it's a lot harder to explain to somebody why that work is important than if you work on a particular aspect of cancer research, for example. And so thinking about this is just such a great exercise for you to do in terms of like, how am I going to explain this? How am I going to explain to somebody else that my work is important? Because you know that it is, but you're so deeply embedded in it that it's almost implicit knowledge to you now. And so figuring this out can be really useful. So great. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to get into talking about some elements of storytelling, and I'm going to talk about them in the context of some different examples of two scientific research articles. So the first element of storytelling is plot. Plot is pretty basic. And actually the scientific inquiry, the process of scientific inquiry really mimics the sort of process of a story. So this image that I have here right now, this little shape with the weird tail, or the triangle, I guess, with the weird tail, is the narrative arc. So the narrative arc is something that we use in literary studies to plot out the narrative arc, like the narrative structure of a story. So in scientific inquiry, we ask questions. So this is like kind of the introductory part of the story. Then in the rising tension, as we go up the triangle, we're formulating hypotheses. We're working through the initial stages of the journey. Then when we make and test predictions, this is when things change. This is when the question starts to get an answer, and whatever we're studying starts to change in our eyes or in our understanding. And then in the falling action on the other side, as we're coming away from the climax of the story, we are drawing conclusions and sort of getting ready for the next story. So those are sort of some of the basic elements of plot. So plot is really just the structure of a story. What comes first, what comes second, what comes third, and so on. The plot, if you're thinking about this in terms of a scientific paper, occurs over the course of the entire paper. So some of the things we're going to talk about happen just in the introduction or just in the results, but plot is looking at the entire paper. So here's our narrative arc again. So in a scientific paper, we're introducing the characters, the problem, the tension. Then the tension builds and we go out on a journey to solve the problem. So this is when we start to say, here's the problem that we have. Here's what I'm going to do in order to solve that problem. Then the climax is the turning point for the main character. And we're going to talk in just a minute about what the main character is. And this is really, again, when our understanding of what that main character is or does or its characteristics, when that changes, and then we start to resolve the tension. So now we've got some answers to the question and we're able to come up with some conclusions. So plotting this out on a scientific paper, we've got the introduction, we've got the background and the methods, we've got the results, and then we have the discussion and the conclusion. So really it does follow. If you look at like any movie you read or book, and again, the scientific paper, they do follow this particular structure. How long each of these parts takes depends on the different paper or the story that's being told. So in some papers, you might have a huge introduction and background section and maybe smaller methods and results. Or you might have a huge methods section and smaller intro and background. You might have a big discussion, conclusion, might be short. Totally depends. So the ratios of the triangle can change, but in general, they all follow this curve. So let's look at a couple of examples. We've got one example that is more, they had to be examples that I could understand. So one is like a public health and one is around AI. So in this example, this is an article called Laws Limiting Access to SNAP Benefits for People with Felony Drug Convictions, a Policy Mapping Study. We've got our narrative arc. So in our introduction, we're introduced to the problem. People with previous criminal legal system involvement faced structural barriers to food access. So this article is all about how people with felony drug convictions in some states can be banned for life from receiving SNAP benefits. In the background, we start to learn more about what the federal SNAP policy is. So this is our background information about the problem. And then we learn that some states can opt out of this lifetime ban that's federally implemented. Then we start to learn the methods. Okay, they identified and mapped SNAP policies related to assistance and benefit eligibility. They looked at it for all the states. They looked at it for the years 2004 to 2021. And then the results is where our understanding of the problem starts to change. So the problem is that there's a federal SNAP policy in place for people who are convicted of felony drug convictions. And then the result is when we start to understand that actually there's been a shift away from this lifetime ban. And a lot of states have either eliminated the ban or modified the ban. And then in the discussion and conclusion, that's when we talk about kind of the larger impacts of what we've learned from the journey that we've taken on this problem. Now we're talking about the impact of recidivism, the effect of policies requiring drug treatment, the role of parental incarceration on food security of children. So you can really see how we move through quite the journey when we map it out in this way. We move from, there's a problem we've identified, we want to learn more about the problem. We go on a journey to learn about the problem. We figure out something about the problem. And now we get to sort of sit down and think like, what was it all for? What did we learn from that journey that we went on? So let's look at another example. This one's called Towards Accurate Differential Diagnosis with Large Language Models. So this was essentially, there's an AI tool called Amy, and the researchers are using it to see how well it supports clinicians with making differential diagnoses. So again, we've got our narrative arc. In the introduction, we learned that large language models can help clinicians with differential diagnoses. This study focused specifically on the use of this tool, Amy. In the background, we learned that some in current AI systems lack interactive capabilities that can improve, a clinician's use of them for differential diagnoses. We learned about the methods. So the clinicians generated differential diagnoses lists first without assistance, and then a second time with assistance. They compared them. They did some qualitative interviews. The results, so now our understanding of our question is changing. Clinicians using Amy as an assistant produced a differential diagnosis with higher top-end accuracy and differential diagnoses with greater quality, etc. So again, we're wondering at the beginning, we see a problem, we're wondering, is this gonna work? We go on a journey to see if it will work, and then the climax of the story, the turning point of the story is when our understanding of that question changes. And then in our conclusion and discussion, we talk about some of the bigger picture. We might need to be cautious about extrapolating these results. There's a gap between Amy and clinicians because clinicians had access to more information. So what would happen if Amy also had access to that information? And then just general discussion of limitations of AI. So you can really see any article that you read, you can sort of plot this out, partly because it's easy with the different sections, but it's also, I find it really helpful to sort of see, did this article really take me on the journey of a story? Or if it's really hard to plot it out like this, then maybe they didn't do a great job of really building a narrative. So now we're going to talk about the characters. So character development is an essential component of any story. The reason we want to watch a story or read a book or anything is because we care something. We could care a little bit, we could really not like them, we could think they're funny, whatever the thing is, but we have to have some kind of connection to the character. So character development happens primarily in the introduction and background. This is when we're meeting all the key players. And it's important to mention that characters are not people. So you are not the main character. Your lab isn't the main character. The main character is the thing that you're studying. So this could be a data set, this could be a disease, a protein, a tool, a method, anything that you are looking at to see how it changes over time. So you're really looking at the thing whose change you are observing. We want to think about what are the characteristics of this character? What are its strengths and weaknesses? What are any other relevant, quote, personality traits about the character? We're going to look at some examples. Supporting characters you may or may not introduce as well, but they probably will be present. So they are going to help your main character along your journey to solve the problem or resolve the tension. These might happen in introduction and background, depending on the relationship between sort of your main characters. So like, for example, we might say the clinicians were the main characters in that AI article, and maybe the AI tool is or the supporting characters, for example. And then the antagonist would be anything that's a barrier to your main character's journey. So let's look at a couple examples. So here's the SNAP benefits article again. So the main character, the thing they're studying are actually the state policies from 2004 to 2021 regarding the lifetime ban on formerly incarcerated people receiving SNAP benefits. So even though the introduction is giving us context about, the rates at which formerly incarcerated people are unable to receive SNAP benefits, information about food insecurity, those aren't the exact things we're studying. Rather, the thing we're studying is the state policy because we're observing that to see how our understanding of them changes over time. Background information about our main character. There was an act that enacts this federal lifetime ban, but that act also has some provisions that allow states to modify or eliminate the lifetime ban. So these are important characteristics for us to understand about these state policies. The supporting characters are the databases that the researchers used in order to learn about these state policies. So they have 4 here that they looked at. And an antagonist could be potentially inconsistent record keeping. So this could be, an antagonist could be something that makes it challenging for you to do this research, challenging for you to observe the changes that you're looking at. Here's our second example, and that didn't come out right. So this is for the large language model one. So we can see that the main character, the thing we're studying, is actually differential diagnosis accuracy. So even though this article talks a lot about the AI tool that they're using, they're not really studying the tool, rather they're studying the accuracy rates of differential diagnoses. So background information that we need to understand is that differential diagnoses combine clinical history, physical examination, investigations, and procedures, and require clinicians to weigh multiple diagnostic possibilities in the light of increasing amounts of clinical information over time. So this helps us understand the complexity of differential diagnoses. Amy, the AI tool that they're using, is actually a supporting character. So this is something that's helping us, influence the way that our main character is changing over the course of its journey. And then I wasn't quite sure about antagonists for this one, but I thought maybe limitations of AI or mistrust of AI, because that comes up a couple times in the article. So you can sort of see like rethinking the way that you are introducing your characters. I mean, probably everybody is providing background information and some kind of introduction, but really thinking about, like, especially when we are struggling with the scope of the background information, how much information to include, it can be kind of helpful to think about them as this character. Okay, what do people need to know about this character in order to understand the journey that this character goes on? And what might be extraneous information that maybe is for like a spin-off show or, a fan fiction novel or something about this main character. Okay, so the most important thing we're going to talk about today is tension. So tension is absolutely essential for any good story. Any good story you read, anything that you are like really enjoying, even if it's not super suspenseful. Obviously, suspenseful shows, thrillers, mysteries, they have tension, but any story is going to have tension. And I thought this was really interesting. I read this from a scientific journal editor that she feels tension is the #1 thing missing from scientific papers. And I'll show you a little bit more in just a minute. So tension should be introduced in the introduction or the background. It should be established from the start so that we know why we're reading something. We know why we should care. So tension is really the problem or the conflict or the unsolved question, the unsolved research question that your main character is going to overcome or answer throughout their journey. So it's the reason that you're doing the research. It's the gap. So tension makes a story exciting. So when we were thinking at the beginning about stories and people were talking about stories being engaging, this is why stories are engaging in part. Character development is part of it, and tension is a big part of it too. And tension really helps the reader understand why your research is significant and why they should care about it. And again, that ties into us wanting to convince people that our research is important. So really, really important that we build tension. And tension is created by establishing the gap. So what is known or unknown about our topic, maybe there's a problem with the current interpretation, etc. So really making sure that you're establishing what is the gap and how am I proposing or how am I going to be filling that with this research. So let's look at the SNAP benefits article again. So interestingly, I picked these two examples. I was going through and building out the examples when I made this presentation before, and I realized that I think both of these articles don't have enough tension that they established in the beginning. So I'll show you why. So in this first example, they state that eligibility for federal SNAP benefits is highly restrictive. And that formerly incarcerated people experience higher rates of food insecurity than people without a history of incarceration. Okay, that's convincing to me. Yes, we need to study this. We need to figure out what's going on here, how we can change. Then they talk about this act that imposed the lifetime ban, etc. And but because there's the provisions that the states can change it, there's a patchwork of policies. Okay, so I'm like, okay, patchwork of policies, that's not good. So the gap then, they say the progression of state policies past 2015 and a characterization of the specific modification provisions are not well documented in the research literature, including the details of state-by-state modifications over time. So they've presented me with a very clear problem about the SNAP benefit bans on formerly incarcerated people. But what they're proposing to look at and study doesn't directly relate in my mind. They haven't done a great job, I don't think, of connecting why looking at these policies and how they've changed over time is going to help us address the issue of food insecurity among formerly incarcerated people. They do get to this, I think, in the discussion, but getting to it in the discussion is too late. You want to tell me up, because by then I had said, I don't think I need to read this article. So, or I don't need to fund this project or whatever. So I think they needed to introduce the tension earlier and really establish why and how their work is important in resolving the problem that they are talking about. So you can also have too much tension. So this isn't a real example from the article. This is just me imagining like if they were to write this article with too much tension. So not enough tension. Now we're going to talk about too much tension. So same thing, eligibility is highly restrictive. This act is imposed federally, but states can modify or opt out, resulting in a patchwork. And then this is what it would look like if there was too much tension. The full details of this patchwork aren't well documented, nor is the effect of different types of bans on the relationship between recidivism and the food security of formerly incarcerated people. So here's all the things we're going to look at. State by state history of SNAP benefit bans from 2004 to 2021, type of SNAP ban versus rate of recidivism versus food security, and trends for number 2 over time. So you can already feel like, whoa, this is a lot of information. These are probably 3 separate projects here. So you can also have too much tension where you're saying, well, this is true, and we also don't know this, and we don't know this, and we don't know this. And so we also want to avoid having too much tension. So here's the Goldilocks version. Again, this is not from the article. This is just me making this up. So eligibility is highly restrictive. We've got the act that we've talked about. So the gap, which again, they get to in the discussion, but I think could have been highlighted earlier, is that the full details of this patchwork aren't well documented, making it difficult to measure the effect of type of SNAP benefit ban on the food security of formerly incarcerated people. So once I understand that we need to understand how the policies have changed in order to understand how the food security of formerly incarcerated people has changed over time and what they're currently experiencing, then that helps me see, okay, yeah, then I can see why you want to do this work. I can see why I'm caring about this question. Let's look at the other example, the large language model. So again, this is from the article, and I don't think that they establish enough tension. They said differential diagnoses are challenging, but they don't provide any information about the rate of inaccuracy of differential diagnoses without AI tools. So it's a little bit of like, yeah, they're challenging, but are we doing okay at achieving this? If so, do we need to intervene? They say the capabilities of AI are promising, but I'm left asking, okay, but just because we can, should we? If it isn't broken, should we fix it? So again, they're not really saying like that there's a clear reason why we should intervene with AI. So the gap they established is that previous studies have evaluated the use of AI as standalone diagnostic tools, but we don't know how these tools work alongside clinicians in real world scenarios for the development of differential diagnoses. Okay, I mean, that's a genuine thing to study and I can understand why that's valid, but I don't really understand the problem behind it. This is a little bit of the AI, world we're living in now of like, well, let's see what AI can do with it. So to me, I feel like it's not that it's not a valid thing to study, but I just don't know the problem that they're trying to address. So it just feels a little bit like, as people like to call it, the fishing expedition. Let's just see what happens. So here's an example if they had too much tension in the same article. And again, I imagined this. So now if they said differential diagnoses are challenging, but there's a high percentage of inaccuracy among emergency room physicians who are under high pressure and time sensitive conditions, and rheumatologists who are under complex conditions in terms of diagnoses. And these were two groups that they talked about in the research article. So now I'm saying, okay, we've got a problem. There's this high percentage of inaccuracy. And AI is a promising intervention. We don't know if AI is more effective as a standalone or interactive tool, or if it's more beneficial in high pressure or time sensitive or simpler cases, or low pressure, less time sensitive, more complex. And so then I want to look at all these different things. So here's too much tension. There's too many things we don't know, and I'm going to try to encompass all in one article. And then here's my Goldilocks version. So again, differential diagnoses are challenging. Maybe there's a high percentage of inaccuracy. I don't know that that's true. I'm just saying that. Or maybe it's just an undesirable percentage of inaccuracy. And other solutions aren't feasible, such as more staffing or longer wait times for diagnoses. So AI seems like the perfect thing to intervene. So using standalone diagnostics, AI as standalone diagnostic support tools haven't increased the accuracy rate. So we want to try to use them as collaborative and more interactive tools, such as this tool. So now I can sort of understand, okay, there's a real problem. AI is a good option because other options aren't good. So I'm getting that rationale. And now I'm really starting to see the connection between the intervention, the AI tool, and the problem that we're trying to solve. So now I'm really feeling like, okay, this is a journey that we need to go on, and we need to find out what the answer to this is. So that's kind of how you can think about the tension. And I know that feels like a lot because I'm breaking each of those articles down in a bunch of different ways, but really just trying to show that, you can have not enough tension, you can have too much tension. And so you really want to figure out what's the right amount for the scope of what you are working on. If you're proposing, a 4-year project, then yeah, you might have more tension than somebody who's proposing a 6-month project, for example. So now let's talk about the climax or the turning point of the story. So this is really when you've arrived, and this is the results section. This is all the journey, all the background information, everything we've done. This is bringing us to whatever we're going to learn about our main character. This is the turning point in the main character's journey. This is when our understanding of the main character changes, whatever it is you're observing, the policies, the protein, the differential diagnosis, rate of accuracy. This is when it changes. This is when the tension or the research question is resolved, at least partially. We know that many of us will do research where we have a question, but the question might not be completely answered by the research that we do, and that's fine. But this is at least where our understanding changes. Even if our hypothesis is incorrect, our understanding has changed because now we have that information to add to our understanding of the main character. And this is where some or all the questions are answered. So here's the example. So with the SNAP benefits one, the turning point in the main character's journey is that we learn that there's a major trend in policies on SNAP benefits that have a shift away from the lifetime bans. So states are either enacting no ban or they're enacting a modified ban. So there's a lot more room for formerly incarcerated people to access SNAP benefits. And the research question being resolved, we learned that all but one state eliminated or modified the lifetime ban. So these are our results. Now we're understanding a little bit more about that question that we asked. And with the large language model one, the turning point is that clinicians using Amy as an assistant produced differential diagnoses with higher top-end accuracy and differential diagnoses with greater quality, appropriateness, and comprehensiveness compared with the status quo for clinical practice. And we resolved a bit of our research question. Amy is supportive in the differential diagnostic process. So now we have come over the apex of our triangle and we're coming down the other side. This is called the resolution. And this is really where we answer the question, like, what was this journey all for? What was the purpose of doing this? Because every piece of research we do is focused usually on something fairly small. We're looking at, something that's moving us forward in one step, might be a big step, but often is a small step. But now we want to talk about, okay, what are the bigger picture implications of what we're doing here? How does this fit into our other understanding? So this, of course, happens in the discussion and the conclusion, or discussion/conclusion, however you're structuring. And so the resolution is what the results mean for your main character in the context of the conflict that you've introduced. For example, how your understanding of the main character has changed, implications of the results for the characters, questions that are still unanswered, future direction, like what are the next journeys that we need to take? If this is a movie, what's the sequel? So in example 1, the discussion conclusion that they talk about is the correlation between SNAP benefit bans and recidivism, the effects of these policies, the ones that require drug treatment, what effect that has on access to SNAP benefits and food security, and then the role of parental incarceration on the food security of children. So we're bringing it back almost kind of to the intro where we introduced the original problem of food insecurity because we were really starting with something broad. Then we moved into really specific, talking about our own research, and then we move out broad again when we get to the discussion and the conclusion. In the large language model one, we talked about this a little already, but cautious about extrapolating results to support the recommendation of Amy as a standalone diagnostic tool, because again, they were looking at it in conjunction with clinicians. The gap between Amy and clinicians could widen if Amy actually had access to all the images and tabular data that clinicians had. So they're saying Amy might be better than we think it is because it didn't have access to everything clinicians did. And then they talk about the general limitations of AI. So again, what did we go through all of that effort and all of that intervening for? But how do you turn this all into a scientific paper? So it's all well and good to kind of think about, the structure and or the different elements of your story, but how are you going to put it all together? So this is where the ADT structure comes in, or the and, but, therefore structure. So in the and, but, therefore structure, the and is its general purpose is to state the known facts and to start to build some of the momentum. So in a story, this would be where we introduce the main characters. In a scientific article, this would be the introduction. We start to state the known facts in the scientific literature, background information. The but is the general purpose is to establish the tension, the conflict, the problem. So we start with the and, we know this, and we know this, and we know this, but here's something we don't know. So in the story, this is the tension. This is the problem the characters must solve. This is the journey to solve the problem. In a scientific article, this looks like the introduction and the methods. And the therefore part is, so we're saying this happens and this happens and this happens, but here's something that we don't know. Therefore, here's what we're going to do. Or, therefore, here's what we're learning. So this is the resolution to the tension, the conflict, or the problem. This ties all the narrative strands together. So we're getting all the background information and the story of the journey. In a story, this is where the problem is solved. The characters return from the journey and they're changed in some way. And in a scientific article, this happens in the results, discussion, and conclusion. Let's look at this. We're going to look at this in the scope of an abstract. So here's an abstract. I'm not going to read the whole thing out loud, but here's sort of how you can see it broken down. So this first part, the first 2 sentences is the and. We're establishing that there's a major challenge. Here's a necessary feature. So we're talking about a little bit of background. Then we move into however. So that's the start of our but section. And then we have what we do in the methods. So however, most studies have focused on this. Here, so here's what we're going to do. We combined field studies with behavioral mesocosm experiments. Then the blue bold our results indicate starts the section of the therefore. So then we learn about, a summary of their results and what those results suggest. So we really see the and is the known facts, The but is the knowledge and the gap, or the knowledge gap and the methods, and the therefore is the result, solution, and the future direction. And just like we were talking about earlier, we can have not enough tension. So we could be missing tension, and that could be what we call the and structure instead of and, but, therefore. So here we're seeing we've got the flux of detrital particles. We've got like an introduction of the topic, first sentence. Then we've got we investigate something, something. We use this. This ecosystem model generates this. Model outputs are compared. We find this. We find this. Temperature indirectly drives this. High temperatures combined with this result in something. So we're seeing just like a lot of information, but we're not really seeing a clear tension established. We're not seeing any place where there is a clear but being stuck in there to say, and here's the problem. Here's what we know, but here's the problem. Then we can also, just like before, have too much tension, but. So right now we've got an intro sentence, and we've got however, something, something, this limits our ability, however, something else, it lacks the capability, this could have, this fails to interrogate. So we're seeing like, we know these things, but we don't know this, and we don't know this, and we don't know this. And that's just too many things to include because we don't know what direction this article is going to go in based on all of these different problems that it's presenting. So the original one that I showed where it moves through the and, the but, and the however, or the therefore, that is how, that's kind of a good structure, a good pattern for that particular, setting that up so that you've got an accurate or an adequate amount of tension, but not too much and not too little. So using ABT in a full manuscript would look something like this. So if we're using the IMRAD structure, introduction, methods, results, discussion, then that can kind of look like this. We've got an abstract, introduction, methods and statistical model, results, discussion, conclusions. Discussion and conclusions might be combined, and then an appendix maybe. So the abstract is really where we're kind of laying out the whole plot summary. This is the description on the back of the book. This is the trailer for the movie that you're going to see. This is where we give the whole ending away. And then when we get into the article, the introduction is where we have the and part. We're introducing the characters, we're introducing the tension. And then the methods and statistical model, this is all part of the but section. This is the journey to address tension and to answer the question. And then in results, conclusions, and discussion, this is the therefore section. This is the climax and the turning point. This is the resolution of tension where we answer our research questions. So that's what I've got. I'm happy to take some questions. Love to hear what you all are working on. If you've got anything you'd like to share.
All right, so now we are going to go ahead and stop with the recording. If you happen to have any questions, feel free to either raise your hand or put it in the chat.